Hello there. Welcome to this fifth and final session in our series on tourism reimagined and the Great Ocean Road. I'm Peter McPhee and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm a historian at the University of Melbourne, including environmental history, and I've also enjoyed being part of the Great Ocean Road community since I was on the board back in the 1950s. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge half of the panel that we're gathered today on the lands of the Wadawurrung people, traditional custodians of the waters and lands of this part of Australia. Respects to their elders, past and present, and pay our respects also to any First Nations people who are with us today. As an observer of the series so far, I've found it particularly fascinating in all sorts of ways. I've really enjoyed the way that even though we've been looking at the specificities of the Great Ocean, we're very mindful that this is a global debate, a global concern that we're discussing. The way that the series has moved backwards and forwards between international examples, the global context, and the local has been particularly interesting. We've explored with the panel the meaning of some key terms, the difference between extractive tourism and what we call sustainable tourism. And we've also explored the idea of a regenerative tourism and seen fascinating examples of how that might appear. The panel has stressed the importance of clear and thorough data in making sensible decisions about tourism and its impacts. One of the issues that we've been debating, and which I'm sure will come up today, is the whole question of regulation and who decides. What is the relationship between local, state, regional, national authorities and local communities? Who makes decisions, and how does a properly collaborative approach really work? And finally, what is tourism for anyway? What are how should the benefits of tourism be shared? Who stands to gain and lose from it? And in particular, should we understand protection of the environment as just one factor in making decisions about tourism, or is it really the bottom line that should take precedence over everything else? They're just some of the questions that I think have been raised in this series. Now, let me introduce the panel who are going to be responding to those and other questions of yours. First of all, Peter Christoff, who's chair of the Great Ocean Road Communities Network, or GORCN, and currently a senior researcher with the Melbourne Climate Futures Institute at the University of Melbourne. Peter's had a long association with environmental and social issues, including as the Assistant Commissioner for the Environment in Victoria, Vice President of the Australian Conservation Foundation, and as a board member of Greenpeace Australia Pacific. Next to him is Dianne Dredge, the founder of the Tourism CoLab, a pioneering leader in regenerative tourism, focusing on transforming destinations to prioritise environmental restoration, community wellbeing, and systemic change. She drives initiatives that empower communities and stakeholders to co-create tourism rooted in equity, resilience, and ecological health. In the middle, we have Liz Price, the inaugural General Manager of Great Ocean Road Regional Tourism, or GORRT, a distinguished leader and advocate for building a balanced and sustainable visitor economy, with over 2 decades of experience shaping regional, state, and national tourism strategies. You've met those 3 people previously. One person you haven't met, but we're particularly delighted to welcome to this session, is Libby Mears. Libby is the chair of the Great Ocean Road Coast and Parks Authority, or GORCAPA. She's honed her leadership and collaborative skills across various roles, including as a 2-term mayor of Surf Coast Shire. She's been chair of the Victorian Coastal Council and CEO for 10 years of a successful non-profit business which has delivered broad social impact. Finally, online, we have another former panellist, Ruth, Regional Director for the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, or DEECA. She's responsible for regional delivery of projects and services alongside statewide lead roles for coastal protection assets, coastal adaptation planning, and the Great Ocean Road Reform Program. And finally, as backup, we have 3 other people who aren't on screen, but I want to recognise Justine Linley from Corangamite Shire Council, Matt Taylor, the Manager of Economic Development, Arts and Tourism in the Surf Coast Shire, and Penny Spalder, a Senior Associate at TRC Tourism and a recognised leader in sustainable tourism and destination development. But we have a wonderful lineup, and to begin with, I'm going to ask Peter and Dianne to spend a few minutes reflecting on where you think this series has taken us so far. Peter.
Peter, thank you very much, and hello to everyone. It's a real privilege to be here and to be here at this part of this series, which I hope everyone else has found as enthralling as I have. It's been very interesting in terms of the various questions and puzzles that it's opened up for us. What I want to do is just very briefly expand the frame of our discussion. If I was to rename this series now, I'd perhaps call it Reimagine in Turbulent Times. And I think it's really important for us to recognise as we continue the discussion today, as I'm sure we do the minute we think about it, we are now in, for at least for all of us, I think, who are watching the series, in unprecedented global, intensifying, ecologically turbulent times. We're facing quite extraordinary political and economic challenges, which will have implications at the national level, subnational level, and regional level. And we're facing an intensifying ecological crisis, particularly in relation to climate change, with its growing threats and extreme events, which again are unprecedented and for which we have to plan. So these are the pressures that I think we need to anticipate in a precautionary manner. And of course, when we think about it, we are trying to, but some of them are very, very hard to factor in. The earlier discussions, I think, have highlighted the sort of existing drivers and pressures on the Great Ocean Road and its region. Liz, your presentation really outlined the importance of population growth and, of course, also affluence as a way of increasing tourism and, in particular, visitations to the region. This is almost an unstoppable dynamic in one sense. There are also social expectations which we have to work with. Understandably, the expectation that people will have an equitable access to a public resource, the much loved public resource of the Australian coast. So under those circumstances, resilience and adaptability as key goals are going to be very hard to manage. In the process of doing that, we're going to be dealing with a range of other issues: transport, housing, economic infrastructure, commercial development. This really is a very complex whole of government process. So where are we now? I think that we're still confronting a growing torrent of tourism. I think this came through in a number of the earlier discussions, in particular Miraba's representation of where we're heading. A torrent of tourism without apparent checks, which I think is largely acceptable to government, but of course is leading to a deferred crisis. So under those circumstances, what we're looking at is the tragedy of the tourism commons, where people are simply rushing into that space without intending to harm it, but creating enormous additional pressures. We have to think very carefully about what the responses might be to that. Now, Ruth and Jody last week addressed some of the things that we should be optimistic about. There are lots of plans and strategies and reports imminent, but of course they could also be promissory notes. There's a great deal of anxiety about what some of these very delayed strategies and plans might deliver to us. So let me just focus on a couple of things that I think are of concern, looking at this from the community network point of view, looking from the ground up, if you like. Firstly, there is that issue of sustainability, sustained carrying capacity and risk management. Again, to go to those terms that we used last week. If you're going to have evidence-based policy, you need to have information. You need to have precautionary planning based on timely, accurate, appropriate, widely available information, and also modelling, which takes into account the realistic expectation of, for example, an extremely turbulent climate future and the disruptions that that'll provide. So we've seen the Environment and Economic Asset Evaluation Report, looking at it closely. It's a report that best that it can with the data available, but there's significant data gaps. We're anticipating the State of the Environment Report, but from my experience, the State of the Environment Reporting, a lot of that work is done with significant gaps of information, particularly in relation to indicators that we have to follow through very carefully. So we've got good good data on visitation growth, we need equally good data on baseline economic and social changes to work with. And so I think that one of the things we need to think about very carefully is a very explicit gap analysis and plugging those gaps. And that, of course, then raises the problem of where does the money come from to do it and who's going to be in charge of it. And this has been a perennial problem in terms of data, if you like, information for this problem of tourism governance. There's secondly, I think, a set of problems to do with governance itself. And this is again from the network's point of view. I think some of the problems are let's call them agency-facing or interagency problems, and we'll all be familiar with these. The problem of the priority and capacity to deal with tourism in the context of an overall policy agenda, which is not really giving tourism a great deal of priority. So it's hard for departments focused on this issue, DEECA in particular, to actually push this as an agenda which the government really needs to pay attention to. There's been a real lack of priority, and I think that's come through in those enormous delays in delivering plans and strategies. There's also clashing policy goals between departments, and that became very clear last week. The difference between Miraba's talk about what the expectation was, which was increased visitation and increased revenue, as opposed to the much more nuanced responses, I think, that we got from DEECA, for example, Ruth's comments, indicates, I think, a real tension between departmental or agency goals. And that's something that we all recognise and have to work with. There's also a problem, I think, about the granularity of the goals that are being set. And the fuzzy targets are often very hard to hit. And from a community expectation, targets need to be a lot tighter to enable accountability and responsibility to be tracked and reported on. Then there are public-facing problems. These are the problems I think that the groups within our network and others have been facing up and down the coast. The first one that's come through in the questions is the problem of understanding agencies' roles and responsibilities. The complexity of the landscape, the complexity of the policy landscape and the agency landscape is both understandable, but very hard to get your head around. And communities often find it very hard to navigate that space. Who governs what? How do they govern it? Who's responsible for it, in particular in relation to compliance? Secondly, and more problematically, there's the issue of public consultation, in the sense that a lot of the consultation is, some of the consultation is tokenistic rather than sincere. There's a sense of being consulted to death. This is a term that's come from Indigenous communities, but I think it applies sometimes to ours as well, leading to a deep cynicism, sometimes a disengagement, and sometimes an increasing anger amongst individuals and communities that are trying to work in this space. A real sense of exhaustion when resources are poor and time is poor. And if we're thinking about this in the context of round up, engaged tourism process or strategy, then keeping the community engaged is clearly very important. At times, the response processes and the time involved in reacting to valid community concerns has been inappropriate and sometimes is regarded as disrespectful. And the last problem in terms of this sort of public engagement issue is the weak or sometimes absent social involvement in governance. The communities that we're dealing with along the coast here and of course elsewhere in Australia are often extremely well informed about what's going on the ground. We're sort of overeducated busybodies in many cases. The sort of people who've retired to these communities or who've moved down here are often extremely skilled and competent in understanding what is occurring in this landscape. So the involvement of those communities directly in co-production of strategies and plans and their implementation, I think, is something that we should look forward to. So how do we deal with these problems? And I don't want to focus simply on problems because there's a lot of very positive stuff to consider as well. One of the issues I think we do need to consider in this articulation of what the next steps might be are what governance will actually look like. Have a discussion about governance. What are the regulatory measures going to be that are going to be applied? Are they going to be direct measures in terms of limits placed on regulation, with all of the difficulties that come with that, given community expectations, broader community expectations, access limitations are very hard to engage with. Are they going to be market-based measures? And if so, then what will the impacts of those be in terms of social equity? Fees and other market-based mechanisms sometimes can be incentives rather than brakes for growth. if you rely upon for revenue. And lastly, and I think this is really important, there's a very, very significant role for education, not only within the communities up and down the coast, but more broadly. If we're seriously talking about limiting visitations to the region, then there's going to be a great deal of misunderstanding and hostility to anything that cuts off access to what is regarded as a rightful public resource. So the issue of education beyond the region about how this fragile region can be used, I think is a very important one. If these things are addressed, I think we end up with legitimate, deep consultation and a very respectful involvement of the community in the formulation of policy overall, co-production of the outcomes rather than sort of paternalistic delivery of them to the region and to its communities. So I've ended on a note which I think is ambiguous and ambivalent. I think there's a discussion for us to have around that sort of regulatory frame and how we deal with it. But in terms of the specifics of developing regenerative tourism, sustainable tourism, I think it's an appropriate one for us to perhaps open up for today.
Peter, thanks very much. Just before we hear from Dianne, could I just remind people, and I should have done that earlier, to put your comments and questions in the chat function. Many of you will have a view function on the top right of your screen that will enable you to have a gallery view or just a view of the speaker. You might want to use that. And of course, keep your audio and video turned off, please. Dianne, over to you.
So can I just get you to every time someone speaks, is that you can really hear me? Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Peter, for those comments and the granularity that you've provided. I guess where I'm coming from is working at that kind of more systemic level, and my opportunity is to really sort of maybe raise up and talk about some of the systemic issues that I've observed. But first of all, I'd like to actually acknowledge the incredible moment that we have here right now, in that this wonderful series of conversations could be a watershed. It could be a moment in history where you choose to work differently, or it could be the moment in time where you go back to doing what you always do. So I would just like to actually acknowledge this as being a moment, a watershed, that's an opportunity and a hopeful opportunity. That to me is really important here, and the quality of the conversation. It's almost like I've been witnessing a bit of an onion being opened up, because there's layers of initiatives that are going on. And that for me is really heartening, that it's not just, because in a lot of other regions that I've worked in, it's actually just a marketing solution. So I really acknowledge, and I'm really very grateful to be part of this conversation, because I think it's very hopeful. So my observations are really generated through this prism of working across multiple destinations at multiple levels in multiple cultures. And so I don't have that granularity. And so that's why I acknowledge what you've said, Peter. I think, so on that context, I think what's important for me to say is that what I've observed is a lot of busy work. Like, everybody is trying to do the best that they can do. And there is a lot of knowledge, there is a lot of expertise, technical knowledge that exists. And that, again, it's very unusual to find that concentration of technical expertise. But I think there's also a problem that when we do get locked into that busy work, we forget to, sort of have a look above the parapet to actually see what's going on everywhere else, and what's actually going on in the system. And I don't mean it to be a criticism, but I think it's going across the world that, these systems around the way that tourism is set up, and it's been institutionalized through policy and through the goals that the legislation has put in place. What's actually happened is that we've focused on meeting whatever those goals are. And I think that in the conversations previous to this, it has been around that recovery, consolidation, and acceleration. So that's just the accepted framework, because that's come from the top down, and it's come from the top down, and it's kind of layered into the thinking. It's layered into the ways that funding and incentivization happens in the way that we work. And it's not just here, it's everywhere, really. So I'm going to share with you some of the observations that in the conversations that I have, and maybe it's a little bit provocative, but everybody says it underneath, but they don't actually come out and say it. So I'm going to say it. We have a real policy issue, and it starts at the top. We have a policy issue where we are embedded and wedded to growth without really understanding why growth is what we are seeking to achieve. So if it is only growth to extract the resources, to extract the good of local places, to monetize places, but not to give back, then we actually really have an obligation to address that. And it doesn't start, it most likely doesn't start with the top realizing that, oh, we've got the wrong policy goals. It actually starts in all of the places that I've been working with. It starts at the local level. It starts with local communities and local organizations starting to say, you know what? Growth for the sake of growth is not what we want to pursue. We want to pursue a kind of well-being, a kind of community wealth building where tourism gives back to local communities, and it enables nature and culture, even our infrastructure, to regenerate. So it's a different kind of mindset that we're talking about here, and it does require 3 conditions. So when I talk about regeneration, regeneration requires a mindset shift. So we're shifting the goals of what we're working towards well-being and community wealth. It requires systemic change. So that means looking at what are the barriers to thinking differently, what are the structures that are keeping us only playing in this small within these boundaries. So can we actually break out of this and actually redesign the goals that we're working towards that fulfill what our communities need and what nature needs, etc. The third thing about regeneration is that we have to measure what matters. And I know, I know that we're all measuring as much as we can measure, but are we measuring what matters at a systemic level? We might be measuring how many light bulbs we're changing, or how many water, sensitive measures we can implement in our businesses. But really what we need to be measuring is what matters at a systemic level, so that we can actually ensure that the tourism that we are supporting is the kind of tourism that's actually giving back, regenerating, and contributing to the thrivability of our local place. So for me, it's a very different kind of tourism. I personally love tourism. I'm so committed to a kind of tourism that enables people to connect with nature, to connect with themselves and other travellers, and to really appreciate the places that they visit, because then they will actually give back, because it just makes perfect sense. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of the systems change and measuring what matters. So I guess one of the things, one of the other points that I'd like to make is that I observed that the root cause of the problem, so there's as I said, there's this amazing amount of work that is being done, and very careful, well thought out, considered intellectual work around how to manage. But is managing visitation the root cause of the problem? And I suggest that actually the root cause of the problem is the policy and the goals of the system. And so we need to think about what's happening above us and zoom out to be able to really appreciate and understand the levels that we have to work at. So one of the things that we do is we go to work and we only sort of think about what we've got to do that day, but we need to also remember to zoom out, you know, look above the parapet, as I say, to sort of see what else is going on. And in the talk that I gave, there's actually quite a lot of case studies about communities that have just started in very small ways to change the system. So one of the things another thing that I observed here is that the enabling conditions actually exist right here. It's not about saying, oh, it's too difficult, we don't know how to do that, or we can't reach the policy right at the top to be able to advocate for change. The enabling conditions exist here. So the enabling conditions that I've noticed in this conversation is that the community is self-organised. That's amazing. The community has self-organised, has found a voice, and is stepping up to its caretaker role. It's organised. So that's a really big and important step. There is a willingness to learn, and the fact that everybody is sitting around this table and the people that are tapping in today, there is a willingness to learn, which is very exciting. As Peter said, learning, all of us, you know, whether it's visitors, you know, tourists, the people working on the inside, the outside, operators, we all need to learn. There's a willingness to learn. There's a capacity to evaluate what is really going on. And one of the things that I said is there's this amazing coalition of people who are bringing in diverse experience. So that is the capacity to evaluate and to actually step above the parapet. And then finally, courageous leadership. There is courageous leadership here. There's the presence of bigger thinking as opposed to that reactive problem solving. So I do think that these enabling conditions are right here that I would really encourage everybody to step into. So I guess finally, what I'd like to say is that regeneration and regenerative tourism is actually not about tourism. It's actually about how we integrate tourism back into how we go about life, how we go about work, the values that we work towards, and realizing that it is part of thrivability, and that thrivability, that flourishing, we need to actually describe, identify what that is, and that's a small step just to describe and identify that and then work towards that. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
This is a very interesting contribution that's come up in the chat room about a wellbeing framework that has been developed in New Zealand along these lines. But two wonderful, provocative opening statements. Liz, is there something you'd like to respond to and what you've heard?
Probably I'm the optimist though. So the probably one bit I disagree with is I think we've been on this journey for some time. So someone who's been in a role for nearly 10 years, I've seen enormous change over the 10 years. I don't think we've got it right and we're there, but I am actually quite optimistic about the journey we've been on. And I think that there is an absolute coalition of the willing, and I do think there's an enormous amount of big thinking leaders that have been really willing to put down the barriers around, well, that's not in my patch, to have that broader thinking about, well, where does that most logically sit? I think there's more collaboration now than there has ever been. And especially, you know, if I look at 10 years ago when I started in the role, most of the agencies didn't talk. So I do think, you know, they were, and I think they were just in the do. They were down in the weeds in the do. And, you know, I think some of the big challenges, we talk about the fires back in 2015, 2016, but they really brought everybody together. You know, coming off the fires, we then had landslips and we had some real challenges around the road. So it was no longer one agency's responsibility. I know there's a lot of frustration with where GORCAPA's got to in their first 5 years, but the fact that we've got a GORCAPA came out of a lot of noise to say the system was broken. So I do think, you know, part of keeping the momentum and keeping that coalition of the willing is also celebrating the successes we've had so far. And then looking at where they're not working. So I do think it's, you know, it's great to start to see more organisation of the community. That's one community. How do we bring all the communities together? How do we make sure it's the residential community, the visitor community, the business community? And so I think that's the next stage, is to really look at how do we do that. I still feel one of the things we're really missing is a framework to actually work on the solutions and agree on the solutions. Because yes, you're right, it's not just management. The types of products and experiences will really challenge what people come here for, how they consume and engage and be part of the communities when they're here. And so I think there's some really big challenges. And I think the frustrations from where I sit is I'm seeing lots of projects stall because there isn't that mechanism to bring all of the communities' different opinions together to have those discussions. And you're right, the policy is often broken, and what's happening from above and the way funding works is what's broken. So, you know, we're going to potentially have some projects that fall over because we can't work to the timeframes that the funding comes through. And then we won't get another go. So I think, you know, how do we find that mechanism now to have those really thoughtful, all-inclusive conversations around what are the various solutions? There is no perfect one. So every solution someone's trading. So what are those pros and cons? What can we, you know, agree that we can live with? What can we not live with? What become our non-negotiables? And how do we then form a really solid framework for future decision-making as we go through?
And Libby, you've had some extraordinary experience, you know, helping set up GORCAPA and being mayor of a shire and on the Surf Coast and so on. What reflections would you make about this?
Oh, it's such a great conversation. And I guess firstly, 25 years of living on the Great Ocean Road in, you know, bringing up a family. You're quite right, Liz. The work has been ongoing. It's been a gentle journey. But to have an outcome where we have a GORCN, quite frankly, didn't happen overnight. It happened because there's been years and years of people passionate about their communities and how to continue to preserve what is felt like being lost at many stages. So GORCN is a product of, I guess, the work that we've been doing for a long time, and an absolute tribute, really. And you're right, the Great Ocean Road Authority, you know, I was on council when we were talking about so many people making decisions or actually not making decisions on the coast, and nothing is happening. How do we actually think differently about the management of the Great Ocean Road and its coast and parks? And that's been, you know, back in 2004 when I was first elected to council. So these are things that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so I get that we want things now, but this considered nature of where we've come from to this point, I think we are really on the journey. To me, I don't think about tourism. It's not the lens I look at. We're a land manager. We're the manager of the marine waters, the coasts and the parks of the Great Ocean Road. And then within that, we have 21 amazing and very different communities who sit and enjoy a privileged position of being in this space. And then we have visitors who want to experience what is so very precious and what these 21 communities have, which is a really shared set of values. So we're in a space where we all know what we love and why from different reasons. And as a land manager, our job is to continue to enhance and protect the very important natural environment. So I think it is actually, for me, the starting point really is the environment, Peter. You asked that question. That is actually got to be the starting point, but it's not the only point. It is what sits within the community values, the traditional owner learnings and knowledge and story and songlines. And it is about then how do we understand that's the context, and not one community is the same. So then how do we understand what the experience of visitors and tourism is in all of the communities? Like what you said, Liz, it's very different. The impacts of tourism in Torquay is very different to the experience of tourism in Aireys Inlet or further down the road at Port Campbell. It's very different. And there might be a greater sense of being able to cope with some things in Torquay, for example, that would definitely not work further down the coast. So we need to know our communities and what their sense of values are, what their sense of priorities are, and how might they be shared and broadened for the visitors. So, it's a great discussion. I could talk all day, so I better stop though.
Because you have got to get to Diane's point though, that, even in terms of we talk regenerative, it's actually a mindset shift for the way we all live.
Completely.
And I think, again, if we look at, good or bad, that enormous amount of our visitors are coming from the city. I don't think the city connects with the impact they have as much as we do see living and breathing it in a regional area. So I think that's a really big challenge for us in terms of that education piece that you talked about, because it is a much broader education piece, which if you look across so many, it's falling on a lot of deaf ears. So, whether it be councils trying to work through recycling programs, and you see the resistance they have to, those sorts of things. And that's councils across the whole country, not just in our little patch. So I do think that whole mindset shift is a big education, that people are not understanding what their impact is.
Yeah, but we also know after years and years of research, which we did at the Victorian Coastal Council, which is now the Victorian Marine and Coastal Council, which is Victorians' attitudes to the coast. Longitudinal research done by Ipsos, which shows us really clearly Victorians value a natural environment, a clean environment. They're actually quite simple things, and that hasn't really shifted over the years. And so when someone from the city comes down and sees bins overflowing and toilets not clean, that's actually not what they're coming to experience.
And does that take into account the changing population, with the migrating population and those changes?
Oh, that's a good point. I haven't had a look at the different sorts of research waves, but I think more broadly, there was a sort of shared thing that you're coming to the beach or you're coming to a natural environment and you want it to be clean, and you want the water to be clean, you want the environment to be, well managed.
I think just a point to bring in Ruth to see whether she'd like to comment on the discussion so far. Over to you, Ruth.
Yeah, sure, and thank you. And look, I'm very happy to sit here to listening to the discussion, to be honest. But yeah, so look, and I think it's it's really clear, the message around the overarching strategy for visitation management, which does encompass a lot more than just the tourism, which I'll go into. And there's no doubt we need to take a different approach. And to echo Dianne, your comments earlier, the optimism that we have these conversations happening, and to Liz, the way that you've mentioned we've shifted to be able to be in this room and have those conversations is moving in that direction. And, this is where I'm excited for the part that we're contributing to the strategic framework plan, which I talked through last session, and the visitation management framework that will fall from that and proposes that new or it's not, I wouldn't say it's new, but it's that coordinated framework for an active stewardship approach. And there's a few things I'll just touch on from different speakers. And one is around the departmental relationships, Peter, that you mentioned. And I think I'd actually push back on that a bit. And I think that we're in a good position now with our government in terms of we have, a real obvious signal in that we have the same minister now for tourism and the environment. And that's a recognition of the importance of both those things and the balance between both those portfolios. I'd also say that tourism growth, in my mind, can work with dispersal, I think is what we're talking about in our areas too. The tourism and the impacts we have at the moment, a large part of the problem is same time of the day, same locations, same products. Is what's driving a lot of the damage. So that's why some of these focus around sort of dispersal things, I think, can be accommodated with growth. But having said that, I think it's acknowledging the role that our natural environment plays in driving people to want to visit and people wanting to live here. That's, a lot of the reasons people want to come down and live in the Great Ocean Road as well. And I think the commitment that we've made recently in the economic accounts is a really good demonstration and towards that direction of trying to quantify in a bottom line term of the economic value of those natural assets in the Great Ocean Road. I'd support the comments before about co-creation and that being really important. And I think it's recognising, which we all do, in that there is inherent conflict, potentially. If you're coming from polar ends of a spectrum of either purely residential community long-term living or a short-term visitation approach, those two things are never really going to marry each other. So, or marry up with each other. And so the conversation we're having is, how do you move that dial along the spectrum to really acknowledge that neither one of those preferences in the extreme will be realised, but we have that responsibility to be co-creating, to work out where on that spectrum do we need to land, and recognising, as Libby said, that that will differ in different locations along the Great Ocean Road. And that's where I think the risk-based assessment tool that we're proposing as part of this framework will have its benefits, in that it's entirely adaptable. And you will have parties across that spectrum coming together to agree on threshold approaches for destinations, upper and lower destination limits. And you will have, you know, those discussions around what do those thresholds and indicators look like? Are they, you know, ratios of visitors? Are they sentiment surveys? Are they adequacy to meet services, and all those kind of things? And then picking up on the wellbeing framework that was posted in the chat, you might pick up some of those impacts and some of the indicators that are in those approaches from a community wellbeing perspective. And you might say, well, what are the indicators from something like that wellbeing index that we want to be aware of? And when they're compromised, that triggers some of these threshold responses. So I think there's a real ability for that tool to encompass the representation from both those, I don't know what you want to call them, opposing views in terms of coming together and finding that balance. And look, I'd also echo Dianne's sentiment there that tourism is connecting to the place you visit, and visitation, I should say, and authentic visitation is something we all seek. And, you know, in the Great Ocean Road context, that's not just coming and looking natural beauty out of context. That's experiencing authentic communities. What does daily life look like for people who live on the Great Ocean Road, as well as the natural environment and the context? That's all part of the visitation experience. So if either of those things is failing, you know, the underpinning of why visitation is happening in the first place isn't sustainable, in my view.
Can I just, going on from that, Ruth, can I just raise a contradiction though, and something that's coming through very strongly in the chat and was there in previous sessions as well, and that is that we've heard repeatedly this expression, community of caretakers. There are so many different layers of society and government that care deeply about this part of the world. We feel that we're a community of caretakers, and yet the single greatest frustration that comes through the chat room is from people saying, either I don't know who to approach if I've got an issue. There's an interesting comment from someone at Apollo Bay this morning that went swimming with a group regularly. At the same time, the harbour, someone decided to dredge the harbour. I don't know who's in charge of what aspect of life along the coast. And secondly, what is the appropriate way for consultation and cooperation to actually occur? So I think, you know, one of the issues that you highlighted to begin with, Peter, was the lack of clarity that many people feel about how do all of these caretakers fit together? Who's responsible for what? Are they overlapping? Are they competing? Or are we all part of a community of caretakers? And if so, is it possible to be clearer about where responsibilities lie and how local communities can make themselves heard? I don't know, Libby, whether you want to reflect on this.
Just on the harbour, and I saw that comment, and we are now the harbour managers, but and I think the harbour's dredged every 3 weeks, and so a harbour dredging schedule is probably a really good idea. But, you know, a community member in Apollo Bay, you can walk over to the harbour office and have a chat. So, you know, there's opportunities there, I guess, for us to be proactive in the community. It's not saying it is a moving feast, though. We are changing the governance arrangements. So this, you know, 2 years ago, Colin Hotwashire were the harbour managers. Yes. So things are changing and it's not settled yet. That's part of really big change. It just takes time. But I do appreciate the importance of being able to raise an issue or a concern, and that we should be able to direct that. You know, it kind of should be no wrong door, really. Whoever gets it receives it and moves it on. So there's something about being able to that more effectively. I do agree.
But there's certainly the relationship between GORCAPA and GORCN that's brought this together you know, is, I think, a very good example of how there can be a productive
Absolutely.
relationship of that type.
Yes.
But certainly there is a frustration that a lot of people who love this part of the coast feel that they're not quite sure. So who really is in charge of this dimension of?
I just thought actually it kind of should be managers without borders in a way, because no one really cares who does what until something isn't done, until something goes wrong.
Yeah, sure.
And there's fair bit of stuff that needs doing at the moment, and that's the reality of life on the coast, and that's where people are really wanting to be able to raise their issues and feel like they've been heard. So there is some work to do around that, but it's generally absolutely Greater Ocean Road Authority or council.
Just on that, I mean, I want to come back to what you made a really interesting one, but just on that, one of the experiences I think that people have been having when things go wrong is that there has been a sort of a lack of clarity between agencies sometimes as to whose responsibility it is. And so for water quality, for example, management of water quality, there's been real difficulty in finding who actually should do what. Eventually, you know, in the couple of cases we've had recently, that has resolved itself, but it's taken far too long. So I think it's sometimes a discussion between agencies as much as between the community
And
as
anybody's been
agencies.
involved with the water quality issues, and we've all got our beloved estuaries all the way along the coast. Actually, it's been a really big issue. It's been challenging, and there are many players involved. Part of the role the authority is really stepping into is, okay, leading the leadership of the coordination of the agencies who all do have a role in you know, one part of it, or an interest in, you know, estuary management, estuary opening management, water quality.
But there is also an issue of cost, and sometimes
Completely, absolutely.
it's sort of the past the issue.
In a cost-constrained environment, it is really challenging, and that is the world we live in. Yes.
I want to go back to which is ask the conch. The conch is now mine. This is terrific. I mean, you're up. Oh, that's fine. I just want to talk. Look, you're absolutely right in terms of the different geographically dispersed communities of interest. You've made the point. Visitation really substantially, a torrent of people coming from Melbourne, Greater Melbourne, Geelong, and so on. And if we're going to deal with some of the issues that, on the one hand, everyone does want a beautiful, clean environment to go to. On the other hand, you have the tragedy of the tourism commons. You just have lots and lots and lots more people coming in there, and the results are not the ones you want. So you've raised the issue as to how you deal with that larger community. We know what the communities up and down the coast want, but that larger source of visitation, and how you talk to people, work with them, educate them, which sounds very paternalistic, to actually understand that there are limits, there have to be limitations, and then to work out what the right sort of regulatory framework might be. Strict regulation, market-based instruments, and a cultural change. How would you do that? Let me put the hard question back to you.
I'd also add another one to that, and it's about the products and experiences. So I do think another part of what's missing is that non-weather dependent, year-round products and experiences that people come here in the heart of winter and have an experience. Because at the moment, there is very much that, you know, we're our peak summer destination, and they're coming in the part of the community that's really frustrated is they're coming for that coastal experience. So I don't think there is a silver bullet, and I think there's a whole range of things. And one we've talked about is around the capacity limits and working out what are the capacity carrying limits at various locations. And then most of them that you'd find already don't have the base infrastructure to support any visitation, or very limited. Now, whether you go to the Californian redwoods, whether you go to many of the other waterfalls, you'll see that there is very limited infrastructure. So I do think then it's actually setting up that prioritisation of infrastructure and advancement that's going to suit, now, what are the priorities of communities that live there first and foremost, and then that they want to share with visitors as they come through. So I think that becomes really important. But the big one that sits over the top then is, what is the mechanism for revenue generation to actually have the funds to deliver on all of those things? And that's where we always get caught up is, you know, and if you look at the way government cycles work, if you look at the way funding programs work, what we generally end up doing is retrofitting a project, trying to meet the which is kind of what Dianne was saying, trying to meet the retrofitting a project into what are the guidelines for where the funds are currently available. So what we do need is a very different system. The current system's broken.
Because we need to bring in the questions that are coming from the audience, and it links very much with what you've just been talking about, Liz. I mean, one of the key questions that people are raising again and again is about revenue raising, and the fact that so much of the tourist economy is based on the day trip to the 12 Apostles, a sort of an extractive type of tourism that doesn't generate much income for local communities, or if any. What is the appropriate way of managing an increasing volume of people who are engaged in that sort of tourism in a way that is going to make it possible for agencies like GORCAPA to provide the necessary infrastructure? I mean, that's a question that's come up again and again in the chat room. Who'd like to comment on that?
I would actually like to. This conversation is really reminding me of the amazing work that's happening in Hawaii. So the community engagement there took 2 years. During COVID, people paused and it was all online, but they did this deep engagement called the Aina Aloha Challenge. And that brought people together within smaller networks, within larger networks, to really talk about what were the capacities in their localities and that sort of thing. One of the things that came out of that with respect to building a kind of a flourishing is that there are so many not-for-profit organisations, community groups who are doing this work anyway and would like to be monetised. So in Hawaii, they started to work with these not-for-profits to develop visitor experiences using the capacity, the expertise, and then building regenerative business models underneath it. And that meant that there was a dispersal of the income that was generated from tourism. And not only that, the visitors who came had the local stories, the connection to place, understood the environmental challenges, and it was this deepening. So it's not about providing visitor experiences that are, ecotourism experiences or nature-based. It's about who in the community, what is the capacity in the community to support those people that are already doing it and would like to lean into this. And the not-for-profits have literally, the capacity has increased and people have bought into the idea that they can host visitors. They don't want tourism in the same way, but they would like to host visitors. So there are different ways of looking at this and different areas where there is existing capacity that could be channeled.
I think there is a reality that our coast, we have bookends. We have Torquay, maybe 25,000, we have Warrnambool, maybe a bit more, 30, 40. And then across the coast, we have little communities of 3,000 people or less, actually. And so, the capacity is in there or it might not be in there. So it's a sort of a reality that actually we're not particularly heavily populated. So we do need to think also about how to stimulate new activity. And going back to your question, Peter, I guess, and Liz, you would be really confident that, the shipwreck master plan, which really is the vision for that whole precinct down past the 12As, which has been worked on for a lot of years and led through, there you go, 2015, led through Corangamite Council, great council down there doing fantastic work. And there is a vision there to help disperse tourists. There is a big vision around changing the way people see it and spend time. There's big investment going in, which is going to offer maybe events and experiences at different times of the day. So that sort of 10 till 2, 11 till 1 blockage can be moved on. It all takes time and it all takes dollars. But some of that work, which was highly engaging work with communities, sits there to be delivered. And I guess that's what we just have to get on with, quite honestly.
I also think you've got to be particular when they're talking about even which fixing the problems and extracting dollars out of visitors. Some are easier than others. So to me, the international day trip market is probably one of the easier ones that could be tackled. A new licensing system, that didn't go back into consolidated revenue, that actually stayed in the region that it was collected, but also changing what they can go to at what times. So at the moment, it's just a blanket license to be a tour operator.
Yeah.
What we would like to see is that, you know, you are licensed to go to certain sites. And Surf Coast Council did change the way they do licensing when they changed Bell's Beach.
I was on council.
Correct.
I remember it.
Substantially made a change. They changed the capacity down to only 8 a day,
Yeah.
the times they could go, and the size of buses. So we've actually had examples where you can actually make a change and get a result from it. That wasn't a blanket thing across the rest of the region. So we still have licensed and unlicensed. And I think they're probably our biggest challenge at the moment.
Yeah.
But to then address some of the unlicensed, then you need the funds to do compliance work.
Yep.
You know, and be there and be finding them and making sure. That's a big expense. And no one at this stage is yet, you know, without having the money coming in, can also do the compliance.
I mean, in terms of revenue, of course, everyone focuses on the international tourist market, and that's one part, one segment. But the largest part, of course, is just people coming down the coast. And we do have the problem of the Great Ocean Road as a thin strip road, which has got limits to its capacity, probably already hit them. To begin to deal with that and an increasing volume of traffic of small cars, individual families and the rest, probably requires a form of regulation that is going to be politically very difficult to present and swallow. We've already seen that just in terms of parking fees. How are we going to do that? And again, this is a part of that story, as you've said, Libby, this is a segmented problem. Different parts of the coast have different characteristics, different qualities, different attractions. Great Ocean Road part is very, very difficult, I think, in that discussion.
And I think some of that is where new product and experiences go, so that there's not a single journey. Because at the moment, for enormous amount of them, it is a single journey straight down the Great Ocean Road. So we've got to look at creating multiple journeys, and part of that is what's the products and experiences that are going to encourage to go different ways. The other is we do have to look at a transport strategy. You know, the dreaded international coach. I'd still rather those people in the coach than them all hopping in individual cars and trying to come down the road. So there is that, you know.
A lot of those people are actually coming out of Melbourne and Geelong. They're not the international tourists.
So some of them are visiting friends and relatives, but they're on buses as better than having them in cars. So that's what I'm saying.
It depends on where the buses stop.
Correct, where the buses stop, but we do also need public, you know, because at the moment, public transport's not really an option.
Yes, some people have been asking on the chat, where's the Department of Transport in all of this? You know, why aren't they sitting at this table?
And I think some of the challenge that we get with the Department of Transport, you know, if you have a conversation with somewhere like Wyndham, where the population's growing from 340 to 500,000, they can't service that population with public transport. We fall down the priorities when you look at our population base.
Smart point about priorities and the larger scale of things.
Yeah. There are some wonderful posts in the chat room that are worth following up about Hawaii that you mentioned, Dianne, and some other very interesting websites as well that people are highlighting. So where to from here?
I still want to go back to that question I raised with Liz about how you educate and work with that larger community, the non-coastal community, which is.
And I think the education thing is a bigger, broader problem, and it's actually educating people about understanding their impact and understanding what things that they can do that make a big difference. And understanding the environment, because you know we want to talk about they want clean beaches, but you know, I'm picking up dirty nappies when I go for a walk along the beach when I'm picking up things, you know, and that's not overflowing beaches. That's actually bad choice. Someone that's decided that that's something that's okay to leave. You know, rubbish is the same. If you look at even the road at the moment between Melbourne and Geelong, it's quite disgusting to be driving along and seeing that. So as much as people value it, I'm sorry, that's not the behaviour we're seeing.
And the point I was trying to drive something before is that it takes time. It's not just one message.
Correct.
They have to actually listen to that, hear that message 8 times before it sinks in. And you're really trying to educate very different cohorts of people. So it is a long-term complex strategy of driving mindset shift in this education.
And I do think, I was going to say, and I do think our education system, so I do think we're seeing more of that. So our younger people coming through, you know, and it was one of the things, there was some comments Mirava presented around the Beware the Naughty things and the responsible visitation campaign. Part of that childlike approach is because actually it's often the children that are the ones saying to the parents, that's not acceptable behaviour. You know, we're seeing now a much better understanding of our traditional people because that's something that's coming through the school system. So we're educating them at a young age. And I do think that that's a big opportunity for us, is to how do we have more of those conversations? How do we use things like even the school camp programs to really educate people? You know, if you look at how many people come into our region, that's their first experience, is going to a school camp in Anglesea or Kangarooby down at Princetown. That's their first experience of actually, for some of them, actually being out in nature. So how do we maximise those opportunities to walk with them, those people away with a real lesson and a real understanding and a real education?
I'd call out places like school camps, because they do it.
They do.
You know, they use places like Ecologic to really inform their environmental understanding and doing the rock pool rambles.
Even times fast,
but even the surf life saving clubs,
yep.
All along the coast, who have people often coming from Melbourne to spend time, to do their nippers course, to do their bronze. They are embedded in coastal communities, but bringing a different mindset. So to me, it is the hearts and mind, absolutely, but there is still other frameworks. We do need regulations. We absolutely need to think about those levers. We need legislation. Our new Marine and Coastal Act is actually a really critical piece of legislation that is directing us to what we can do on public land with a view to future generations. And some people may say, well, why can't we build there anymore? Or why is that project being pulled? But it's actually about the reality of climate change. So we need hearts and minds, regulation, legislation, and that doesn't stop. That just has to keep going. And I agree completely. We also need on the ground people, compliance officers, although, you know, often parks had the approach of it's also education opportunity as much as compliance, walking through national parks, talking to people who are there doing things they shouldn't be doing. One strike, okay, second strike, you're out. We do need those things. And, you know, the beaches and the roadsides are a challenge, but look, we've got amazing communities who are, you know, the rubbish rangers from Aries Inlet all the way through, who are picking up rubbish because that's part of a community activity around valuing their environment. Wish we didn't have to do it,
yep.
But there are things that people are doing because they value so much the coast. Yeah.
I want to bring Ruth into this.
No, feel free. No, I will just say, I feel on behalf of my DT transport colleagues, I should say that as part of our framework, they are leading the integrated transport plan that'll inform part of that conversation as well. So I should mention they're not present here today, so they are working on that side of things. The other thing I just wanted to talk through that conversation there, which is largely around behaviour change, is, you know, there's really good lessons we can pick up from something like the container deposit scheme, in both from, you know, children having been around when that was introduced, working on that with the government, and both from, you know, I think all of us have kids who are obsessed with collecting cans and making us drink too much. So it's, you know, it's a good thing for kids to pick up. But it really is that other incentive around people don't value something unless they understand the economic benefit, you know, of it as well. So there's another principle in there around, if you're not investing in what you're experiencing, you don't necessarily value it as well. So I think there's some interesting behaviour change lessons from that program that can be applied too.
Ruth, I wanted to raise something that sort of partly related to behaviour change, but there's a much bigger picture issue as well. Climate change and the problem of resilience and adaptation. We generally still operate in a sort of Holocene view of the world where climate change hasn't yet happened. And yet we've already seen Black Summer, we've had the fires down the coast before. We know just how fragile the environment is and how much more frequent and intense the sort of problems we're going to have, like particularly fire-related problems we're going to have. How do we factor that into an appropriate management of the landscape instead of increasing fire burning regimes? But how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the problem of managing the large influx of people over summer, often with no idea how to respond to any of those issues there? And what sort of resilient tourist economy can you build when you are looking at, and pardon the phrase, a crash and burn sort of landscape?
Yeah, and I can answer that in a few ways. And look, my previous role to this was working in the emergency recovery space. So this is something that is front of mind, and quite often what we're driving in recovery is that recovery really should be synonymous with adaptation. And elements of build back better, although I hate the grammar of it, the concept of, you know, using that opportunity to not build back what we've always had, but be adapting to what we know is coming is something that you'll see more and more coming across government in terms of how we approach things. To give my strategic framework plan a shout out again, considerations of things like climate impacts and bushfire management are going to be part of the balancing recommendations of that in terms of where you would do responsible growth in certain areas, taking into account those impacts. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, and Libby's referred to it before, in terms of our Marine and Coastal Act, which essentially recognises the impacts to our coastlines. And part of that work is our resilient coastal strategy, which is emphasising around planning for a 210-100 timeframe, and really recognising that adaptation across the scheme of those things is something, it's a reality, and it's something that we don't think about in 80 years. We're thinking about now in terms of the impacts that'll have to the immediate Crown land, but also the flow-on impacts in terms of availability of recreational space and all the values that we love about our coast. So there's a few things in play, but it's definitely one of the biggest challenges in a coastal area that we're going to have to grapple with.
I'd like to bring in here a related question that's been posed by Suzanne Kavanagh, who's one of the people who really was helped generate this whole series of webinars. And maybe it's a question for you, Dianne. Suzanne says this: much extractive tourism relies on cookie-cutter experiences. Regenerative and resilient tourism, on the other hand, is deeply place-based and context-specific. Can government agencies move to the change thinking and systems redesign, given much embedded thinking? What do you think might be needed?
That's worthy of a book or two. Look, I do think, and apologies if this is actually a debate that's already been had in the Great Ocean Road, but the elephant in the room to me is whether you continue to accept growth, or whether how do you actually push back on that growth directive and define your level of visitation in a way that gives back to your communities. So I think the redesign has to happen from, looking at the end goals, the goalposts. And that's what, going back to what I was originally saying at the very beginning, is that this, maybe it's not a watershed moment, and maybe you have been working on it for a very long time. But this is a moment where you can say, will we address that elephant in the room? And it is coming from the top down, from the Australian government down. And it's being imposed. And how do communities and organisations who are genuinely working, as you are, with communities to protect the environment, how do they actually work, I won't say against growth, but to work in a better way to actually really define what that means in local context? So I just find there is a whole conversation to be had around how do we redefine the goals of the system.
Can I add? And then can you answer? I wanted to actually, I think that is a great question. And I wanted to follow up something you were saying, Liz, and I guess it might be provocative, but certainly when I moved down to Anglesea 25 years ago, 3 little kids, there was no ring road. So the easy path through from Melbourne to the coast was not easy, because you went through the centre of Geelong, and I think it's 29 sets of traffic lights. Wonderful.
Definitely is now.
It definitely is now. But a wonderful outcome having a ring road, so much easier. But it supercharged the opportunity for people to visit. But what I used to love about those early days was that we got a breather in the winter. And it was almost like, and people used to say, oh, thank God you don't live on the Gold Coast, because it's full on all year round. At least on the Great Ocean Road, we get to regenerate. We get to breathe through the winter. And personally, I think that's the beauty of the Great Ocean Road in winter. It's quieter, it's less busy, it's the product is the fire and, you know, maybe some Thai food inside. I don't know. But I kind of agree that, you know, I was interested in your comments, Liz, about how we think about products, because I kind of find that a language I find harder to connect with. But I think about, isn't the experience an experience that can be just had, doesn't need to be driven and more opportunity created? Am I saying, does that make sense?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
So I do think you don't want growth for growth's sake, but I don't think that a lot of our communities are sustainable and our businesses are sustainable if we don't look at dispersal throughout the year.
Yep.
So I do think we desperately do need growth between April and November. But we've got to think about what are the mechanisms to stop that being just more growth at summer. And that's why I do think the products and experiences. To the question before around what products and experiences, I think what we are seeing is they aren't cookie cutter, because they are authentic products that are growing from local people to deliver local products. Wildlife Wonders was a great example of that. Budge Bim is a great example of that. And that is what's connecting more and more with the consumer. That's wanting an authentic, and the consumer that we want to actively target. They are connecting better with those opportunities to understand the environment, the community that they are being in.
Yeah. I want to go, you go.
I it's just that in the Tourism CoLab, we are really witnessing small, micro, you know, in this very small businesses who are going, you know what, it doesn't work for me the way that the tourism industry talks about all of this stuff. We want a business that hosts people, and they are redesigning their businesses, or they're coming up with businesses, or they're leaving the industry to be able to design the businesses they want. And so we're doing this thing called a regenerative business development program, where people are actually leaning into what their values are, aligning values and their businesses. And I know that there's, 90% or more of the businesses here on the Great Ocean Road are small and micro enterprise. So it sits beautifully within the potential mindset that exists for people here.
And also, I guess that's really good to hear what you were just saying then, Liz and Dianne. And so maybe for me, when we talk about this stuff, we've got to be really context specific and think about, it makes sense to develop product or different offerings in some parts of the road.
Correct.
It's not everything. And so I wrote something down, something for everyone, but not the same for everyone.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to keep it's a nuanced approach around what growth or tourism product looks like. Obviously, it gets driven through the context and the environmental context and community values. But I think we don't talk enough about the nuance, actually.
But I also don't think we talk enough about that. No, they are small businesses, and most of the small businesses are community people, and that's so residential community is one. And so we are seeing even smaller, even if you look at a caravan park, Joe was last night at Pisces, and they've just introduced a sound and light show.
Beautiful.
And it's about connecting to the people there, connecting people to the story through their caravan park. So I do think whether it's a caravan park, whether it's cafes and restaurants, that is the type of product that we see. One is growing, but now is the opportunity to look at how do you develop more. So I think, and for me, the bigger challenge also when it comes to growth is the region for me is much larger. So at the western end, yes, they still are looking for more visitors because they are trying to sustain communities. We have a lot of the northern towns that would be desperate for visitors because that's the only way they're going to get services and products that they can use as communities. So they want more visitors. So if I was sitting in a room with, people from Skipton and people from Derrinallen and Darlington, which are all part of my region, they want more visitation.
Yep.
And they want to be able to have potentially the bank stay or a newsagent's open because they're the services they're not getting anymore because there's not enough people living there. And then potentially in a sector that like ours, then maybe people could work there and live there and they can build their community.
Look, it's a really interesting discussion. I certainly understand what you're saying about that, Liz, but the problem might be that you end up still developing what you'd call tourism sacrifice zones, places which are so intensely flooded by tourists that eventually people then want to escape from that to find the authentic experience elsewhere. Well, how you define authenticity is, I think, a fairly interesting thing. Many of the small, and again, it's a very geographically dispersed, segmented, differentiated sort of region, and we get that. But there are those areas where you perhaps have the capacity for growth. Other areas where, if you wanted to find authenticity as what you had in the beach town in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, that's already under substantial threat, if not utterly destroyed. And there is a serious issue as to why a community which is localized, sometimes very privileged, having been able to buy into that place, should be resistant to further change. But there's nevertheless still an argument there as to what the limits of changing authenticity might be. So I don't know how you differentiate between and regulate between those very different sorts of trajectories.
And I think that's the time to sort of Ruth's point before, is how do we get those mechanisms to have those conversations to get the balance, and where does the balance sit? And that's not the same. It's not a homogenous, this is the balance for the Great Ocean Road. It has to be from that ground up, and this is the balance here, and this is the balance here, because often within communities there's not agreement yet.
No.
And so that's what I talk about, the need to have that framework so we can have these discussions, talk about those trade-offs. Talk about, well, what does balance look like, and what are the products and experiences?
So I absolutely agree with you, but here's the problem. Communities are, and the communities that are part of the Great Ocean Road Communities Network, but many others as well, are very, very intent upon consultation being part of that discussion. But the feeling that has sometimes emerged in those processes is that the consultation is not sincere. That's being really harsh about it. That there is a prior objective, which is about constructing a particular sort of tourism trajectory, which then runs over what the communities actually might be saying and wanting. And I'm not going to name names or places or anything like that, but that has been one of the reasons I think why GORCAN has come into existence, because there is this sense of individual communities being picked off, rather than the sort of the larger sense of a groundswell of response being heard. Now, that's the reality I think we have to work with.
And so, not again, a personal opinion, and I think often that my challenge is a lot of the consultations about the challenge, not actually about the solutions. So we don't sit there often enough and debate the solutions. We don't sit there and understand the real cost of solution A, and I'm not just talking financial cost. I'm talking the full cost of what does that option A do. And you know, and I think that's why we need a different mechanism so that we can have those respectful conversations and sit there and people understand what are the trade-offs.
A deliberative process, actually. The strategic framework plans a critical space, absolutely, but it is the process around how we have the conversation and the work that local governments now do in their council planning, which is deliberative processes.
And iterative.
Exactly.
It cannot be,
Yeah.
There's not going to be, we've got a solution, it's got to be iterative and keep evolving. That didn't work, that didn't work.
No. And there is a healthy tension around things. Some things just won't happen, even if a community desperately wants it to. And there's a space where helping communities understand the reasons why they've been heard, but this is something that has to happen, whatever, from a state government directive or whatever. I mean, that is a reality at times, and that can be very frustrating.
But that's also, as we know,
a
very profound tension, because there's always the sort of view that, well, this is for the common good, the better, the larger, whatever. And so small communities are often outflanked by that.
Well, the MACA, the Marine and Coastal Legislation, is a perfect example of that. Perfect example. But we do have to have an eye to the future. Our intergenerational responsibility is really important.
But part of the challenge, obviously, is when you look at national and many state targets, the national ones in particular, are very much quantitative targets about attracting as many international tourists as possible. I mean, you know, the big tourism dollars in terms of advertising are focused in very different ways to what Liz and Dianne have been talking about.
Completely.
And that's part of the challenge. We're starting to run out of time, and I know that Peter wants to have some concluding remarks. Yeah, but I know he also wants to thank some people. But before then, Peter, can I, on behalf of the people around this table and everybody who's watched any of these webinars, thank you personally. I know that you weren't the only person behind this, but you've taken such a significant lead role. And I think your inclusive and collaborative, collegial approach to discussion and to disagreement has been a reason why it's been so successful, that it's been possible for people to have their to have their points of view heard without being silenced or disapproved of. And, you know, many people are profoundly grateful for what you've done. We've talked about leadership. You and the people around this table are exemplars of that. So thank you. And over to you for some final remarks.
Very, very kind and excessive. Look, I don't want to actually say a great deal, except that I think this is an ongoing discussion. I was saying earlier before we went online that we could actually do this on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis.
Definitely.
Die, as I said. But this really is an ongoing discussion. I think that one of the great benefits of this series, which surprised everyone in terms of having 5 webinars, has been that it has opened so many different doors, so many different avenues of consideration, almost all of which have been unresolved, and clearly they're going to be things that we're going to have to come back to. But it is, I think, a way of getting a higher level of engagement and a better level of informed engagement by all who've participated. And there's been, you know, if you look at the list of registrants, it's really quite extraordinary. A lot from Melbourne, quite a number from the coast, quite a number from overseas, and of course, you know, within the agencies and departments that have been working with us. So I think it's been very, very good in terms of that desire for inclusion, that we've actually had this discussion. I think there's credit to everyone. I think one of the things that this series also has opened up for us to really work with much more thoroughly is this notion of regenerative tourism and other forms of tourism. And I mean, Peter's been pushing me very hard to try and sort of summarize points of principles or anything like that. I am the least qualified person to do that, and Dianne would do a much better job. But I think that there are a number of things that have come through this discussion over the last 5 webinars about what a really good tourism framework will look like. And it includes some of the things we're doing and some of the things we aspire to do. One is there needs to be a mindset shift. You can almost not say that anymore. About exactly what the implications of tourism are in terms of the larger context of visitation, in terms of the larger context of the ways in which we use the landscapes that we're talking about. One of the things that has been emphasised quite rightly is that we have to think holistically about what we're doing. And that is obviously, again, going beyond tourism to the larger social and ecological and economic forces that are driving us. There's also a real concern about making sure that what we're doing is grounded, that it's based on and in rather than simply informed by social and ecological values and characteristics. The issue of having the right data, having the right information to work with, being able to be meaningfully precautionary, understanding what the implications of our actions are, and also aiming for resilience, the sort of adaptive precautionary approach in all of the targets and goals and approaches that we're using. And there are 2 other things I think that have been part of this discussion which are worth highlighting, particularly from the community's perspective. One is that we're looking at processes of planning and policy development and implementation, which at their best are openly participatory. They're clear, they're strong, they're effective, they're legitimised because the governance actually is inclusive of communities, of stakeholders, not just communities on the coast, but stakeholders more broadly in that sort of, at the outset, in the co-production of these policies, and then of course in their implementation. In implementation, we too often rely on government or government agencies to try and implement things. That's not how it works. We know that's not how it works. It's a cultural shift. And the last thing I think that has become really clear in this discussion is the granularity of what we're talking about. Even within this region that we're talking about as the Great Ocean Road Plus, there are so many different problems, issues, capacities, communities, characteristics. We have to bring those in and work with them cumulatively rather than in a sort of top-down fashion. I think that everyone understands that in a theoretical sense, but I think we need to work a little more thoroughly with that in practical terms. And I think that's, again, one of the things that's come through wonderfully in the presentations that we've had. So let me just quickly turn to some thank yous. The first and biggest thank you, I think, is to the audience, to the 300 plus people who registered, many of whom have been listening to these recordings offline rather than crowding into the space, but it has been a really, I think, quite fulsome response. And I'm very grateful for the chat that we've got, for the questions, the provocations that we've got. I also, of course, want to thank the speakers, Anna Pollock, Dianne Dredge, Price, Miriva Holmes, Ruth Caldwell, Jodie Sizer, Libby, and the insights that we've also, Libby Mears, and the insights that we've got from about local initiatives from Coroner DeCara, Lizzie Cork and Joey Saunders, which has been really important in terms of giving us, again, that grounded sense of what we're working with. In terms of the production of this 5-part webinar series, and it has been production, I especially want to thank Suzanne Kavanagh for, I think, her driving inspiration, her relentless, and I'm looking over here because Suzanne's just off to my left, her sort of pursuit of this as an issue and an idea that we should look at. And I think that GORCN's benefited enormously from her insights, as I think has this larger discussion. I want to thank Charlotte Allen for her contribution to establishing the series. Juliette Lefevre, who's been sort of the wicket keeper behind the scenes, catching the chat and sort of highlighting various things and throwing the ball back at us. Peter McPhee for moderating this session wonderfully. And of course, in terms of GORCAPA's contribution, Bridget Isaac, who's been absolutely indefatigable in following through on this, the multiple technological challenges that this thing has presented on top of her day work, her ordinary work, and Ed James for some of the editing they did. So thank you to everyone, in particular to the groups and the communities who have been participating in this. Thank you all.
Thank you all.